minutes. I'm going to take my 30 minutes because that's what I planned for, so if you need to leave at 12:30, that is fine. But I want to give you a sense of how this isn't an optional add-on, that this really is essential to the fullness of faith and who we are and who we're called to be. And Father Kevin really talked about that in the gospel for today. So you're going to get a lot of text. If you want to call Creighton on Monday and ask for some college credit, I will back you. We're going to do a lot in 30 minutes. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops describe Catholic social teaching as a central and an essential element of our faith. Okay. This isn't optional, right? This is not an add-on to the tradition. And you're going to get a lot of primary sources today because I want you to see that this is not the gospel according to Dan. This is what the church has consistently said for at least 130 years. The bishops go on and they describe, however, it is clear that in some educational programs, Catholic social teaching is not really shared or sufficiently integral or explicit. As a result, far too many Catholics are not familiar with the basic content of Catholic social teaching. They also go on and describe that more fundamentally, many Catholics do not adequately understand that the social teaching of the church is an essential part of the Catholic faith. This poses a serious challenge for all Catholics since it weakens our capacity to be a church that is true to the demands of the gospel. We need to do more to share the social mission and message of the church. So what you have an opportunity to do here through Live Lent Together here in Lent 26 is to engage these different dimensions of Catholic social teaching. So I'm going to walk through each of these in the context of what Corey and Lori have put together. Using this resource from Catholic Relief Services structured as pray, share, discuss, and act. So each of the sessions is oriented around the 7 themes of Catholic social teaching, which we'll talk about. And it starts with an opening prayer, moves to sharing, so there will be some opportunity to share your own experience. There will be a reading that's relevant to the content and the theme for that day, opportunity for discussion in a small group setting, and then an opportunity to discern, how do I feel called to live this? What can I do? So a challenge focus and a plan of action, and then moving to a closer prayer. So when we think about Catholic social teaching as a structure or the content for the structure, I think it's important to understand, how does Catholic social teaching fit into the broader context of our faith? And so I want to do a little bit of context and background so that this doesn't seem an optional add-on, but this really is viewed as essential. In the Christian tradition, we talk about spirituality most basically as relationship with God. Right? This is our definition of ultimate value. You can have lots of spiritualities, whatever you take to be of ultimate value. For Christians, it's relationship with God. That relationship is rooted in the core belief that God is love. Right? Michael Himes, the theologian, describes the least inadequate way to begin to speak about God is the claim that God is love. God is mystery. God always exceeds what we know. But the least inadequate way, the best way, is to think about God as love. Morality is our embodied response to this sense of relationship as ultimate. So we really can't talk about morality without first situating it as a response to spirituality. So morality is a response to and a pursuit of relationship with God as ultimate. And when we talk about love, and Father Embeck talked about it today, love in a moral sense is willing and acting for the good. So we tend to use love in lots of different ways. I love my kids, I love my spouse, I love coffee, and I love hockey. Right? I love lots of things. In a moral sense, from St. Thomas Aquinas, love is to will, to desire, but also to act, to do for the good, the flourishing of the beloved. So this is what we mean by love. And from a Christian perspective, the idea is that we are so in love with God who is love that we can't not love in the world. It's a kind of call and response. Pope Benedict XVI describes it in this way in terms of morality. Being a Christian isn't the result of an ethical choice or a lofty idea, but the encounter with an event that is going to put me over the edge. What's that? Yeah, I don't know what's going on. This has been the entire time.
Here, let me work on it.
Yeah.
So it's an advertising mode, so it's the same.
Somehow Google is connected to this entire thing.
Do you know how to?
No, nobody knows how to do it. Google has been interrupting the entire time.
Okay.
Back to input 3. Google's been interrupting the entire time. Okay. So it's a response to relationship. Honey, I got it. An encounter with a person event which gives life a new horizon and a decisive direction. Right? So it's not about principles, it's not about utilitarian calculus, it's about response to relationship. Francis describes this as relationship with God catalyzes a conversion. Right? It changes who we are, whereby the effects of one's encounter with Christ become evident in their relationship with the world around them. Right? So the idea is that we're changed because of our relationship with God, who is love. We can think about this in a kind of framework, and this is what I use with my students to try and hold all this together, is that relationship with God is seen as ultimate. This is our spirituality. Our response shapes both who we strive to become and what we discern to do. So we talk about persons and actions in response to relationship with God. This is traditionally virtue ethics. What are the habits, what are the character traits, what are the dispositions I'm called to embody, to work at habitually developing? This is what am I going to do here and now, A or B, right? So we have choices. And we think about this in terms of a symbiotic relationship. What I take to be of ultimate value shapes how I respond, and my response impacts my relationship or my sense of ultimate value. Either I have a sense that, yes, this is who I ultimately want to be and what I want to take to be of value, or it maybe causes us to change, to question. This is what college students do. I've been living this way, but now I feel called to live differently. This is conversion. And when we talk about being and doing, who we are shapes what we do, right? We tend to act based on our character. We can act out of character, to be sure, right? But who we have discerned to be shapes what we do, and what we do consistently shapes the patterns of who we become. This is virtue ethics. Virtues are habits. How do we cultivate any habit? By doing it again and again and again. So morality looks at persons and actions in the context of response to relationship with God. And so two Jesuit theologians have described a way to try and hold all of this together using a schema. They call it the schema of Christian life. No model is perfect, but it tries to hold these pieces together. It begins with this claim that God is love, right? This radical claim that God is love, and it moves to the claim that God loves us, personally and intimately. You are loved. This is not a distant God on high who wound up creation and walked away. You are loved. But you can't force love, or you can't force a loving response. So the third piece of this is our response. We accept or reject God's invitation. In the Catholic tradition, this is technically what we call faith. So from the Catechism number 142, faith is the adequate response to God's love. Right? And this catalyzes spirituality as relationship. As I say to my students, God passes you a note. I like you, do you like me? Check yes or no. Right? If we check yes, that's the act of faith. And it begins a relationship as spirituality. And within any relationship, there's communication. Right? So this is what we call prayer. If we just stop here, we've got personal piety. This is me and Jesus chilling. Right? My personal spirituality. And that's not faith, but it's not the fullness of faith, because the fullness of faith changes us. So we talked about conversion, right? I'm different because of my relationship. I think, I see, I feel, and hopefully I then act in a way that's more aligned with the object of my love, namely God. And so this brings us to morality, our embodied response in, through, and with love. And we've talked about love as willing and acting for the good, and that love begins with rightly ordered love of self. So Father Kevin talked about it in the gospel today. Love your neighbor as yourself. It presumes rightly ordered self-love. The first person I begin to love differently out of my relationship with God is myself. And as I do that, I'm then able to love more fully neighbor and non-human creation. Right? I can't give what I don't have. If you've ever seen love presented as a kind of vertical and a horizontal, vertical is God, horizontal is neighbor. The fulcrum is rightly ordered love of self. Right? So we love, we will and act for the good in a discerning way in this relationship. And so ultimately what the Catholic tradition proposes is that the fullness of faith, so the title of a book by two theologians, Michael and Ken Himes, is relationship with God catalyzes a conversion that changes us, that animates our embodied response, shapes who we strive to be, what we choose to do. That continues to change us and deepen our relationship with God. So no model is perfect. This presents things in a pretty sequential order. This is always fluid and dynamic and interconnected, and some people come to a deeper sense of faith by starting with action, so this is always messy. But in my experience, this tries to hold together things that we tend to maybe compartmentalize. I've got my spiritual life over here, I've got my actions over here, there's a kind of bifurcation, and this tries to hold it all together in a kind of unity. So we've got this notion of love, and it raises the question, so how do we then love? What is an adequate response? Right? If faith is an adequate response, we have to discern what that is. And this brings us to the area of conscience. And in the Catholic tradition, conscience is one entity with at least 4 different dimensions, you might say. So conscience is a capacity. We have the ability to discern what to be and what to do. We don't always use our conscience, right? So we don't always thoughtfully discern, but we have the capacity, we have a potential. If we use it, we go through a process of discernment, right? Who do I want to be? What do I think ought to be done? And I ultimately move to a judgment, right? About who to be and what to do. And so this, in a sense, is philosophy. What the Catholic tradition suggests is that we can also talk about conscience as place. So this is from the Second Vatican Council. Conscience is the most secret core and sanctuary of a person. There, the person is alone with God, whose voice echoes in their depths. Conscience is heart, right? This is the place where capacity exists, where we go through the process, where we come to a judgment. And when we think about conscience, it's not a one and done, right? So the Catechism describes that the education of conscience is a lifelong task. We're always invited, encouraged to form ourselves in terms of being and doing our response. And here the Catholic tradition offers resources. This is sometimes called the Wesleyan quadrilateral from the theologian John Wesley. But if we think about conscience as place, it's the overlap of this Venn diagram. This is where conscience exists. In discerning who to be and what to do, there's a kind of vertical rational axis, right? This is the natural law. Everybody has an inbuilt moral compass, right? We can use our reason to reflect on our experience and discern, I have a sense of this is what I should do, this is what I should be, or this is who I should be, right? And so we see this in civil society, right? Backgrounds, culture, history, people can see child abuse and neglect and just intuitively know that's wrong, right? We have an inbuilt moral sense. What the Catholic tradition suggests is that complementing reason are some additional faith-based sources, scripture and tradition, right? Additional sources for moral wisdom. We can look to scripture, we can look to the lived experience of the church, and within the tradition sector, we can identify a kind of subset as the magisterium, right? So from the Latin magistra for teacher, these are the bishops seen as the successors to the original apostles, to whom Jesus gave authority to teach, right? To help us understand. This is the realm of Catholic social teaching, right? Catholic social teaching is the body of teaching from the Pope and other bishops given as a resource to help people in conscience discern who should I be and what should I do? Right, so I'm trying to contextualize Catholic social teaching. What is it? How does it fit into the life of faith? And so Catholic social teaching, as I said at the beginning, is a resource to discern who to be and what to do in response to God's love. So it's not the only resource, right? Experience, reason, scripture, other aspects of tradition, but it's a resource. Modern Catholic social teaching began in 1891 with Pope Leo XIII writing his encyclical, so a major teaching document, Rerum Novarum. So the titles are always the Latin translation of the first opening sentence of the document. So he was writing in the Industrial Revolution, he was writing about the impact on workers, he was writing of new things. So of new things is the opening sentence in the document translated into Latin as Rerum Novarum. Catholic social teaching over the last 130 years across all these papal and bishops' documents give principles for reflection, criteria for judgment, and guidelines for action. Right, so Catholic social teaching gives us some ways of thinking about who should I be and what should I do in response to God's love. And this comes from the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church, a kind of major summary from the Vatican. We can think about different principles in Catholic social teaching, and I'll talk about some of these here in a minute. But as Pope Francis described in Laudato Si, it can't be emphasized enough how everything is interconnected. Right? All these issues are connected. So I work specifically on climate change. Climate change implicates human life and dignity. It disproportionately impacts the poor. It compromises the common good. So we can look at these principles, but they're all interconnected, and no principle has a monopoly on an issue. No principle has a monopoly on an issue. So across these 130 years of teaching documents, what the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops identify are 7 themes of Catholic social teaching. So hopefully you've seen these or heard these at one point or another: life and dignity of the human person, call to family, community, and participation, rights and responsibilities, the option for the poor and vulnerable, the dignity of work and the rights of workers, solidarity, and care for God's creation. All of these principles are countercultural. Right? So Father Kevin talked about that. He teed it up perfectly in the homily for today. The way the church understands these, and I'm gonna illustrate this with rights and responsibilities here in a moment, but these give a framework, a kind of reference point to think about who are we called to be and what are we called to do. So these are the themes that Corey and Lori have put together as the kind of framework using the CRS and USCCB guide to structure the Live Lent Together small group discussion. So these are the topics that folks will be talking about. But just to give a sense of how the Catholic tradition understands all of these and really how countercultural they are, I want to spend a few minutes talking about rights and responsibilities, because this, in many ways, in my experience, is sometimes the most shocking aspect of our faith tradition, and yet this is who we're called to be. In the Catholic tradition, almost every one of these principles goes through the claim that every person is sacred. Right? We're made in the image and likeness of God. Every person has intrinsic dignity, worth, and value. It can't be earned, it can't be lost. The claim in the Catholic tradition is that this generates rights. Okay? Rights are defined in the Catholic tradition in a particular way, as claims on the basic goods that every human person needs to live and thrive. This is the Catholic definition of human rights. Based on this definition, the Catholic tradition has a pretty provocative list of natural human rights. So this is from John the 23rd. Persons have the right to live. Persons have the right to bodily integrity and to the means necessary for the proper development of life, particularly food, clothing, shelter, medical care, rest, and finally the necessary social services. In the Catholic tradition, basic health care is a natural human right. It is not a market commodity available only to those who can afford it. It's a build-out of an understanding about what it means to be human. Now, this raises questions about whose responsibility is it, we'll get to this in a second, whose responsibility is it to secure this right, but the claim is that this is not an optional add-on that people can access only if they can afford it. St. John Paul II talks about the right to a safe environment. So we talk about ecology as a natural human right. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops has described the right to migrate for those attempting to exercise their rights. Persons have a natural human right to emigrate. Okay? When we talk about rights, we can make some distinctions between, say, positive and negative. So a positive is a right to. I have a right to these goods. A corresponding negative right is a right to not be. Right? So if I have a natural right to life, I have a negative right to not be unjustly killed. So positive and negative rights go together in that way. We can also talk about individual and collective rights, and we can talk about natural and legal rights. Right? Whether or not the state or government recognizes these as rights, the Catholic tradition says they are rights. They are basic natural claims that every person has. Right? So there may be a difference or a split or a gap between what the state recognizes as a natural right or a legal right and what the church says is a natural right. Right? So this raises tensions. We can also talk about primary and secondary rights, right? Claims in conflict. What happens when a person has a right to liberty and another person has a right to not be made sick in a pandemic? Whose right takes priority? Right? Do you have to wear a mask or not? Right? So it raises questions about how do we navigate life together in society. So it gives a framework for discernment, but that framework is bookended by the other understanding or belief that we're social. right? We are not radical individuals. We are made by God, who is love, who is relationship, and who calls us to love. The ethical claim is that we have responsibilities or duties, right? Not as voluntary niceties, but as part of what it means to be human. And we can distinguish these again between negative and positive. And a negative duty is a duty to not violate the rights of others, right? And we tend to legislate this, at least in my experience in the United States, right? We can't hurt people. But the Catholic tradition goes beyond this and says, in addition to negative duties, we actually have positive responsibilities to help. Not as voluntary add-ons, but as part of what it means to be human. So I teach a course on healthcare ethics, and I describe to my students, if Kyle falls and sprains his ankle walking out of church, and I walk past him, at minimum, I have a duty not to hurt him, right? If he falls and I kick him on the way out, I can be arrested for assault. But if I just walk past him and don't help him, I haven't broken any laws, right? We don't legislate positive responsibilities always in the same way. We can think about this in the gospel, the parable of the Good Samaritan. The parable of the Good Samaritan helped. Maybe the first two who passed didn't negatively hurt the person. Maybe they were minimally decent Samaritans, right? But the Good Samaritan went beyond, right? And fulfilled what the Catholic tradition will call a responsibility. Again, we can talk about individual and collective. We can talk about legal and natural, primary and secondary. We can also talk about the order of charity. This is what St. Augustine described as owing different things to different people. I use the Wi-Fi symbol to illustrate this to my students. We don't owe the same thing to everyone, right? So the first person to whom I have a duty is myself, rightly ordered self-love. I have a responsibility to try and get an education and go and get a job and, provide my own safe and affordable housing. I owe different things to people given the different relationships we have. I owe different things to my kids than I do to my students, right? I owe different things to my students than I do to people halfway around the world, right? So we don't love in the same way, but the claim is that there is nobody about whom I can say, I owe you nothing, right? You are outside of my sphere of compassion, right? Nobody is cut out. A couple of years ago, Creighton's Mission Week had the theme, expanding our circle of compassion, right? That whether it's people halfway around the world or even in future generations, when we think about the environment, there's nobody that I'm not responsible for, right? So it's a matter of discernment as to how this gets lived out. But this notion of rights and responsibilities gives us maybe a more robust way to think about what is justice. So in the Catholic tradition, justice, following Thomas Aquinas, is giving what's due. And Thomas got this definition from Cicero, so it's not unique necessarily. Arguably, what is unique from a Catholic perspective is the answer to the question, what's due? From this perspective, what's due, at minimum, is the protection of natural rights and the fulfillment of natural duties. So it's not only unfortunate when a person is experiencing homelessness or unfortunate when a person doesn't have access to health care. The Catholic tradition would say that's an injustice, right? That's a pretty bold claim in my experience. Additionally, the Catholic tradition emphasizes the option for the poor, vulnerable, and marginalized. We have special concern for those who are most vulnerable to having their rights violated, people who are marginalized for any number of reasons: race, gender, orientation, socioeconomic status, pick a variable. We have special concern for people. We also have a particular commitment to the common good because the flourishing, thank you, Kyle, the flourishing of individuals is connected to the flourishing of the community. And when we think about the common good especially, we can start to ask, well, what is just or fair in a given situation? And we can distinguish between, say, equality and equity, right? So equality says everybody gets the same amount of some good. Hi. How, you like Catholic social teaching? Yeah? Good. No, okay, I'll pick it up. Don't worry about it. I'll care for God's creation. I got it. So we say one person, one vote. That's fair, right? You don't get more votes because you got more stuff, right? So that's fair. But we don't say one person, one surgery, use it wisely, right? We allocate care based on need. So sometimes that's what we consider just. The goal might still be equality of outcome. We raise everybody up, but it's by way of equity of process, right? So it gets complicated when we try and think about what is Catholic social teaching, and it also gets political. And I'm going to make a very clear distinction between politics and partisan. Politics in the classic Greek sense is activities that structure a community. Based on this definition, everything is political. It can't not be. So sometimes you've seen me take our youngest toddler out of church, have to walk him to the back. I would suggest that's political, because we have established criteria in our family for how we structure our little community. And when those standards are violated, there are consequences. When he pushes back and tells me he doesn't like it, he's doing political advocacy, arguably. Partisan is a kind of blind obedience to a particular ideology in the political process. Partisan is toxic. Political is essential, and this is why the Catholic tradition underscores a vocation to politics and why Pope Francis describes that love, overflowing with small gestures of mutual care, is also civic and political. The Church, the people of God, cannot be apolitical if we are striving to will and act for the good, because how we structure our society, for better or for worse, promotes or frustrates human flourishing. And it makes itself felt in every action that seeks to build a better world. Over the weekend, Bishop Joe Tyson from Yakima, Washington, wrote an op-ed on what's happening with immigration right now, and he tried to thread the needle and help people make this distinction by saying that if you're a person of faith, it is more important than ever to view politics through the lens of that faith and not the other way around. Right? So the question becomes, how are we seeing what's happening in society? What pair of glasses are we using to see it? And how developed is that pair of glasses? Have I taken the time to form my conscience? Right? Do I understand what the Church says on immigration and healthcare and gun control and all these things? Thank you, Brady. So it's a matter of what the Church calls social justice. So this is a resource from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. Love, on the one foot, requires charitable works, direct interpersonal service, right? So going to heart ministry, serving people experiencing homelessness here and now, and that's absolutely essential. It's the corporal works of mercy. But the Catholic tradition says that's necessary but insufficient, because we always have to have social justice that looks at systems and structures and policies and asks, are these promoting or flourishing or undermining human flourishing? Why is somebody experiencing homelessness? Right? Is it because they don't have access to basic health care and they lost everything trying to care for themselves? If so, then as we serve a meal, let's also maybe look at healthcare reform from a political perspective. Right? So this is love, the fullness of love. And when we think about how this happens, the Church offers methods, so moral methods in Catholic social teaching. So for example, the pastoral circle, we start with people's experience, right? On the ground reality, not abstract principles from on high. And we can do social analysis to say, well, why is this happening? Why are people at the border experiencing what they are? What are the systems and structures in place? This is an ethics, this is social science, political science, economics, that can then move us to ethical reflection and say, is this right? Is this just? Even more basically, what is justice? And then once we've gone through some ethical reflection, move to action and say, do we feel called to charitable works? Do we feel called to social justice? What does that look like concretely? So it's not a vending machine that gives prepackaged answers, but it's a framework for discernment informed by the Catholic tradition and the implications and the understandings of what it means to be human. So as I said, my job today was to give a kind of crash course in Catholic social teaching, a sense of how it fits into the fullness of faith, how this is supposed to be central and essential to our tradition, as a way to give folks a sense of what is the opportunity here for Lent in terms of the resources and the small faith-sharing groups that Corey and Lori have put together. So as I said, I'm hoping that this is helpful. I know I used every minute of my 30 minutes I was allocated. I know we're over 12:30. But as I said, hopefully this is helpful. I'm happy to stay and chat with folks afterwards. Please feel free to head right over to the basement, grab donuts, coffee, and thank you again for staying and for being attentive, and have a great morning. Thank you.